And a very pleasant good evening. My name is Larry Jordan. We have got an incredible evening planned for you tonight, not only for our live audience here, but for you watching elsewhere as well. What I want to do tonight is talk about the relationship of 4K and HDR, that's high dynamic range video, in post-production. I mean, if you think about it, we've been shooting high definition video, 4K, 5K, 6K, even 8K in production for a long time, but figuring out how to work with it in post is a whole different animal. And should we be working with 4K or should we be working more with high dynamic range called HDR video? Trade shows are awash in 4K cameras and 4K monitors and 4K gimbals and 4K drones. 4K is everywhere in production, but where does it fit inside post? In fact, Netflix and Amazon Prime say 4K is not the issue at all. We should all be concentrating on HDR instead. So what does 4K mean in post? Do we need faster computers? Do we need faster storage? Do we need more storage? Faster bandwidth? Updated computers? Updated software? What do we need to do to be successful with high resolution media in post? And that is what tonight's panel is designed to answer. We've got some of the most outstanding experts that can deal with exactly these issues, 4K, HDR, and what it means in post-production. We're going to talk as a panel for about 45 to 50 minutes. Then we're going to open the floor to questions from the folks here that are live and the folks there watching at home. And here's the secret. If you've got access to a computer, and if you don't, how are you able to watch this? But if you've got access to a computer and you're on Twitter, use the hashtag, the number 4K HDR post, 4K HDR post. It shows up on our magic monitors in the back, and we'll be able to answer your questions as part of the Q&A at the end of this presentation. It's a lot to get into at the very beginning, so let's talk about who the people are that's going to be answering the hard questions. Immediately to my left is Michael Cioni. Michael is the founder of LightIron, which was recently acquired by Panavision. He's now the president of LightIron. They have offices in New York and in Los Angeles. And Michael is a technologist of the first water, and I'm looking forward to hearing his take on technology. Immediately to Michael's left is Mike Whipple. Mike Whipple is the executive director of post-production technologies for Sony Pictures Entertainment. Now, there's two hats that Mike could wear, one as an artist and one as an engineer, and he lands solidly on the engineering side. His job is to get this gear to work and keep it working for the artists to be able to create magic, which gets me to the last person on my far left. Bryan McMahan is a senior digital colorist for modern video film. Once Michael Cioni has invented the technology and Mike Whipple has installed it, Bryan's job is to turn it into art. So Bryan will be wearing the hat of an artist this evening in our conversation. Gentlemen, I am looking forward to chatting with all of you. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Before we get into the really key issues of how we're going to make this work, I want to spend just a couple minutes defining terms. And we're going to start with Michael Cioni. Michael, give us a definition of what 4K means.
4K is a simplified version of measuring how much horizontal resolution exists in a picture. And it becomes the short term to describe quite a few different permutations of high resolution. And sometimes we cram a whole bunch of different things into the word 4K, which actually isn't bad because we all generally know we're talking about something that's not high definition. It's much higher definition. So much higher definition, you might call high definition low definition when you compare it to good 4K.
Let us not go there.
Okay. But we are also starting to hear the term UHD. And UHD and 4K can be synonymous with each other because they represent almost the same resolution, in that the UHD is going to be the delivery package for what you get in your home, and 4K is more synonymous with the delivery package you get in the cinema. This is really easy to understand because it's actually very similar to how it is today, with cinema being 2K resolution and television being HD. So cinema in the future is 4K resolution, or in some cases today, and then in the home it's UHD, or ultra high def. And so I think it actually should be pretty easy to understand because they're linear lines that you can sort of draw between how we do it today in the 2K world and how we will do it in the future in a 4K world.
Is 4K actually exactly 4,000 pixels across and exactly some number of pixels high? Or do we have multiple different specs of resolution?
We do have multiple different specs of resolution because 4K is not exactly 4,000 by 2,000, although that is a 2.0 aspect ratio that would be considered a 4K acquisition format. But we generally, again, that's why it's okay to have different permutations of 4K, because different aspect ratios, like a ultra widescreen 240, VistaVision 185, 2.0, which is how Netflix, for example, plays their content back, and then 178, which is your standard television shape. These can all be versions of 4K that all have a slightly different amount of pixels to them. But what I think, that's a lot of information, but I think if you were to boil it down to a definition, I think of 4K as how many megapixels are in a picture.
Is it just, excuse me for interrupting, but is 4K essentially the same as HD, just more pixels? Can we think of it that way?
We could think of it that way. It is actually 4 times HD, or sometimes known as quad HD.
Okay, so let's just hold that.
Yeah.
So 4K is like HD except more pixels.
Yeah.
But there's something totally different, which I want to get to Mike about. There's a different thing out there called HDR, which is high dynamic range video. How do we define that?
I guess we're talking about high dynamic range displays are sort of the new thing that are coming out on the market. So dynamic range basically is the ratio between the darkest detail a display can describe and the brightest, highest luminance level display can describe. So high dynamic range displays have much higher ratios between the blackest black and the whitest white. Contrast ratios, of 100,000 to 1 instead of 10,000 to 1, or 1,000,000 to 1 instead of 10,000 to 1.
So it sounds like where 4K is simply more pixels, high dynamic range, the number of pixels is irrelevant. It's the levels of grayscale that we have with each pixel, which is different. Is that true?
Yes, that's true. And actually one point that always kind of gets a little mushy when we talk about high dynamic range, when we're describing high dynamic range, we're also talking about a wider color gamut.
Okay, so define color gamut.
The color gamut is basically the most saturated colors that you can create within a display system. So wider color gamuts would be something wider than Rec 709, so something more like P3 that we've been working with in cinema, or Rec 2020, which a lot of display manufacturers are looking into using.
So we can have greater saturation per pixel, and we can have greater brightness per pixel.
Correct.
And greater darkness per pixel.
Correct. So basically, you can describe it as like a larger box that you can now work in. You have a much larger area to work within than you did with a traditional Rec 709 or BT 1886 display system.
All right, so now let's get to the artist. When you're color grading, Bryan, and you're color grading a 4K image, is the grade when you're doing 4K different than 2K or HD?
No, the grade I treat the same way, depending on what color space I'm looking at, being a monitor or a theater. But the grading, what I do, is very similar. There's not a lot of difference, actually, in how I color the picture, how we, give it the densities and things like that. It's very similar.
Okay, now let's flip the coin. Is a color grade in HDR different than
Yes.
color grading HD?
Yes.
And what makes that different?
The whites are much brighter, the blacks are blacker. I can get a much richer picture than I could before, especially with the displays that are out right now at the home. I don't have good blacks. We haven't had them in quite a while. We do now. And it's something we've been fighting in grading for forever. And I have whiter whites. The picture should look the same. The overall image is what you would see, what you would expect to see. But I can give it it snaps more. It's more alive. It's more like looking out a window because I have this extra range to deal with. Once I generally color the same once I'm in that mode, but there are a couple other things I have to watch out for.
We'll talk more about that in just a minute. One more, Mike, a question. Can I get HDR without shooting HDR? Can I inject HDR later, or does HDR work best when it's shot that way?
I would say that a majority of the camera systems right now that we're working with, and a lot of VFX vendors, are already creating imagery in HDR. So you can't really fake it. You can't take something that's not high dynamic range and make it high dynamic range, because when you're capturing high dynamic range on a camera system, you're capturing a tremendous amount of latitude, and you're also capturing a tremendous amount of detail. On a lower dynamic range camera system, a lot of the detail and things in the highlights and lowlights is either clipped in the highlights or it becomes noise in the lowlights.
So for people that are trying to decide how much of this conversation applies to them immediately, if they don't own a 4K camera, they're not able to work in 4K. And if they don't own an HDR camera, they can't work in HDR. Both of these require equipment that originates in that format, true?
I would say the most important thing is capturing the highest quality image you possibly can, because that you can now, how do I describe this? I guess because we were dealing with low dynamic range display systems previously, you could hide a lot of problems, right? Like noise and clipping, and you could work with it creatively. You're basically, when you're creatively grading right now on a system that works in Rec 709, you're taking a huge dynamic range that was captured by your camera system, squeezing it down. That's basically what he's been doing for a living for years. So now he doesn't have to squeeze it down as much, right? So you can reveal more of what was in the original imagery. But if you don't have a lot of dynamic range and other stuff, you're impairing him.
Michael, I remember reading a blog you wrote some period of time ago where you are changing the entire backbone of Light Iron to be able to support high-resolution video. You knew that 4K was coming and needed to make some hardware changes to make that happen. We know the advantages to shooting high-resolution video for reframing and just the better perception of quality, which we're going to talk about. But what are the benefits to editing 4K? Why, if you're not going to distribute 4K, why should you edit 4K?
If you're not going to distribute 4K, I probably would say it's not really advantageous to edit it either. If you're not going to drive very fast, it's probably not a good idea to buy a V8 engine that has 500 horsepower, right?
There's bragging rights.
Well, you can have bragging rights, that's true, and some people actually do like that, and there is merit to that because you're experimenting, exploring, and learning, and those are all good things. But if I was going to deploy a project that was certainly not going to be distributed or exhibited in 4K, I wouldn't probably edit it in 4K either. I think 4K editing, if we think of a cart before the horse scenario, 4K editing must and will come after 4K distribution and exhibition is possible. Similarly, we can look to the past. HD editing, which is extremely common now, wasn't possible or wasn't popular until HD distribution and HD exhibition was possible. And so we need to have a market demand for things first before people tend to start needing to work in it, or at least a large percentage of the population needs to be viewing it in 4K before editors are really going to see a benefit or a change in their behavior of the editing process. Because remember, the editing process isn't about pixels. It's not about color depth. It's not about how much color range you have. That's not what the editing process is about. Still creative process. It's about sorting and finding and crafting. And then it becomes someone like Bryan who is actually responsible for the HDR components in the creative sense. Similar, like Bryan probably can't do much about the edit once it gets to him either. So those are sort of different departments. If you're a do-it-yourselfer, then it's probably in your best interest to edit in 4K, shoot in 4K, edit in 4K, and finish in 4K. And surprisingly, do-it-yourselfers can do that because they have all that's available on a couple different similar software platforms.
Yeah, Michael, that's easy for you to say because you have independent wealth behind you. You're a multimillionaire, you buy your own yacht, and et cetera, et cetera. But most of the rest of us have to earn a living, okay? And most of us have to figure out a way to justify the cost of 4K and justify the cost of HDR because for some reason Sony's not giving this gear away free, which is something you and I are going to talk about after this panel is over. How are we going to make money on 4K? I understand production, you've talked me into production. Broadcast is not 4K and it's not going to be 4K for a near term. Cable is not 4K. We could argue that YouTube is 4K, but it's using a compression algorithm which squeezes stuff down so far. I'm not sure you could see a 4K image compared to a 2K. So how are we going to justify the cost of getting this stuff paid for once we decide we're going to edit in either HDR, which, what was it, I was hearing a wonderful monitor for only $30,000 allows us to see HDR in great quality, which is more than my entire camera collection is worth. How are we going to pay for this? It's your fault. Go ahead.
Well, the truth is, we already are paying for it because the consumer market is driven by mass production. And the mass production, for example, the most popular 5K resolution monitor in the world.
Watch where you point that thing.
Most
5K.
popular 5K monitor in the world is an iMac Retina display because there's millions of them. Millions of people have a 5K monitor. So the displays are already out there due to mass production. By 2020, the most recent estimates are that 50% of US households will have 4K HDR televisions. So in 5 more years, half the country will have that. That's not to mention how many iMacs will be out there and how many pixels Apple will be distributing at that point or how big your iPhone resolution will be at that time, which I am certain will be more than 7 megapixels or 4096 resolution. So we're already paying for it. If you're already paying for it, the sad part is you're not being delivered content on the device that you've already paid for that can handle the content. When HD first came out, Mark Cuban actually started a network called HDNet, and everything was about 1080. At that time, Mark's heart was in the right place, but all he had programming of was like fish tanks and museums because nobody was photographing anything. So he was delivering something to people who had a television that can do it, but the content was lacking. Mr. Cuban had a good idea, but he couldn't produce motion pictures and television series in HD all by himself, and no one else was doing it either. So you already own the display in some way, shape, or form, and it's our job as creative people in the entertainment market who have entered in a nonverbal contract with consumers to deliver them the best thing possible. It's our obligation to do that. They've got the technology to see it.
I do a regular weekly podcast streaming on the web. I have a hard time getting a 720p signal sent around the world. How am I supposed to stream 4K? Don't answer that. I'm going to come back to it because it's actually Mike's problem. Bryan, I have a question for you because you're the artist. How are you, what do you need to be able to do a color grade in HDR? What does Mike have to deliver to you in terms of gear for you to be able to do your job?
It's obviously a different display. Has to be set up, to spec. Whether most of the displays now are P3.
Do you look for a specific resolution on the display? Do you color grade to a specific resolution?
Well, it's actually kind of funny you ask that because what I'm using, and I've done a lot of comparing in different monitors and different resolutions in HDR. And the one that shows me the sharpest picture to my eye has the least resolution, but it has the highest contrast. So I don't know how much really, we all know we're going to be 4K. We have to be. That's just the way the world's going. But that's not really what HDR is about. And so when I see this image on a HD monitor, it blows the doors off anything else. So resolution, I think we have to go there just because of we're in this business. And I do think it does make a difference, but right now, in my opinion, the 4K monitors aren't there.
So do you, in order for you to pick an HDR monitor, you have to see it?
Right now, because it's not a ironed out spec, the spec may be some of it, but it's a baby in what we're doing right now. So there's a couple different variations of monitors, a couple different types of monitors or brands or whatever, and they don't look the same. They're not all the same. So you have to decide what the market is going to be, and the studios are trying to decide that now. And no one is sure yet. We know that you can walk into a room, and if you see a regular HD standard dynamic range and high dynamic range, it's a huge difference. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to see an actual real difference. We haven't seen that in a long time. Mm-hmm. But we're not exactly sure what the workflow is yet. It's new. So I need Mike to set me up with whatever I'm going to be looking at and what this job is for, what my target is. Mm-hmm. And I just sit back and sit with the client and do what we do.
So Mike, now the burden's on you. He clearly needs this $30,000 monitor that Mr.
Yes.
Cioni was talking about before we started.
Yes.
But
Which
what else
is
does he
also
need to
4K.
be able to do? Pardon?
It is also 4K.
Yeah, but he says resolution doesn't count. So we'll go back to just a really good quality HD monitor, hypothetically. But what
Okay.
the question is, in addition to a monitor that displays HDR, what else does Bryan need to be able to do his job from a gear point of view?
Well, I guess he needs to have high dynamic range source images that were either captured from a camera,
Okay.
high dynamic range camera, or, and I guess as well.
Assume he has the media.
Yeah.
So what I want to know is what gear does he need?
I would say that most color grading and editorial systems work in, you basically need to work in high bit depths. Okay, so your color correction system or your conforming system needs to work in high bit depths.
Now, when you say high bit depth, what does that mean? We're talking 12?
Greater than 10.
Greater than 10.
Yeah, so most systems right now, I would say most color correction systems on the market work at 16 bits or higher in floating point. And there's huge advantages to floating point because you can calculate numbers that are, you can calculate extremely high dynamic ranges inside the computer itself. So I would say that most anybody that has a color correction facility already has most of the gear minus the display system.
So in addition to the monitor, existing storage would work, existing bandwidth would work, existing computers would work, existing GPUs would work?
It gets, bandwidth requirements basically change depending on the content you're actually working with. So majority, again, of camera manufacturers offer raw recording on their camera systems, and typically raw recorded material is also compressed. So they're smaller files, which reduces the necessary bandwidth. But then as soon as you start dealing with things like visual effects, and visual effects parties like to work in high dynamic range, so you start looking at things like 16-bit half-float OpenEXRs, which can get large.
If you were to, Michael, if you were to estimate how much of a difference in size there is from a storage requirement, which requires more storage, a 4K image or an HDR image?
I'm not dodging your question, but I want to answer it with a thought.
Think away.
Okay. The problem that we're coming dangerously close to, inadvertently, is this issue of the word or. High fidelity in the future is not about 4K or HDR or wide color gamut. That's the wrong way to go about it.
Now, wait. He defined HDR as having a wide color gamut. Are you saying it's a different thing?
They are technically separate, but we've seen them combined together, and that's why the operative word should be and. I call it the tripod of fidelity. You know how a monopod is not very stable? We all know that. And if you have these cameras and they're on one leg or two legs, it doesn't work. But that third leg, it's not going over. Fidelity is a three-legged tripod.
This is very cool, by the way. Very cool.
And you can make a nice graphic for this. So number one, you've got high resolution. There are people out there whose interests are not in high resolution, and so they talk down about people that are pro high resolution. You can find that everywhere. And then there are people whose interests are in wider color gamut. So they talk mostly about that. Then you have people that really like high dynamic range, but they don't have high resolution. The truth is, high fidelity of the future is 4K plus, wide color gamut, and high dynamic range. That's what we need to be gunning for. And to have discussions or technologies or issues about which of these is the best is something I particularly think is a waste of time, because you need all three of them to make an image that once Bryan sees all three of those together, there's no question this is a superior picture. But on their own, each of these things is a little less compelling than when they fuse together.
Sweetheart, it's not the right answer.
No.
There are some people, I hate to break this to you,
Yeah.
who are not interested in HDR right now.
Certainly.
There are some people who are not interested in 4K right now. And there are some people who have not heard of wide color gamut before this evening and feel much better because of you and Mike today. So to get back to my question, if you only wanted to work in high resolution, or you only wanted to work in HDR, are the file sizes the same, or do I need to look at different gear for one versus the other? Monitoring, of course, being different, because clearly, as Bryan made abundantly clear, you have to have an HDR monitor, and you have to have a high-resolution monitor to work with either of these formats.
If you work with HDR today, you can work with the same drives and the same file sizes today and produce a superior image to what you would have if you did not work with HDR.
So for somebody who wants to experiment with HDR, their
Absolutely.
current system is going to keep up, provided it's
current
relatively recent.
Yeah, if it's relatively reasonable, there's no question. Generally, people have access to things and cameras, and I'm so shocked at all the great cameras that are shooting. If we need to define it, I would say greater than 14 stops, 13, 14 stops. And those cameras are now sub $10,000. Greater than 14 stops, we would consider, we just set a rule, it's high dynamic range. So, and I feel that those cameras are producing pictures that if you were to experiment with it, your driving computer today is working with the same camera in standard dynamic range. So, but as Mike pointed out, you can stretch this further.
But here's the point. Here's the point. If we were to make the transition from standard def to high def, we had to invest a whole lot of money in new gear to be able to support that, in addition to monitoring. But for people that want to be able to experiment with 4K, their existing gear is enough to allow them to get into it. They don't have to feel like everything has to be replaced. They're not looking at a huge upgrade cycle to be able to make that happen. And the same thing, it sounds like you're saying, for wide color gamut or for HDR, with the exception of a monitor. But even so, as you're talking about with the iMac, you could start to get in the ballpark to play with, to see what this is like, without having to reinvest all of your hardware again. Am I stating that correctly, Mike?
Yeah, I would say within reason. You know, most systems that anybody works with have a little overhead anyway.
So then, Bryan, you now have all of your gear. What's the biggest thing that you needed to learn about working with HDR?
Well, when you first start working with it, when I first started working with it, it took me at least a day to get comfortable, because I would make the picture look the way the picture has looked to me in the past. I was lucky to start, or I just finished a picture which I've done over the years 6 times, so I know what it looks like and what it should look like. Once you get used to the HDR, the only danger in color correction is using it too much. I can make the picture snap. I can make the picture come right off. It's amazing, really, when you get into it, if it's shot that way. But a lot of films they're not meant to be that. It's a new technology.
Now, when you say if it's shot that way, what does that mean?
Well, if you shoot if you shoot this scenario right here, and it's a dark room and a couple bright lights, I have to keep it a dark room and a couple bright lights. I can make these lights just go nuts. So, and you have to be careful, because you'll get into a scene, and you know, it's got some highlights. It looks great, but you got to be careful not to overdrive it. And a lot of people do, and because it's a new product. Ooh, look what I can do. And
I remember when we switched from standard def to high def, all of a sudden sets needed to improve in quality. We had to have better makeup. We need to have better costumes. When you're
Yes.
working with HDR, do you have to, are we looking at the same kind of problems?
you are. If you have bad garbage mats, they're going to show up because I have the contrast that it's going to show it to me.
Yeah.
There's a lot of little things like that we have to get used to. Makeup
Give me a
is
couple
gonna-
so I can take notes on what I need to watch out for.
Makeup and things like that, it's more contrast is apparent sharper image. More resolution is a sharper image. The sharper we make this, the more flaws you're going to see everywhere. VFX, like I said, garbage mats. I've run into a couple of those that you just didn't see them before. Another thing that I've run into with doing theatrical is focus. You're talking about the editing. Do you need to edit in 4K and things like that? No, I agree with exactly what Michael's saying. But I get it into my bay, we put it up on a big screen, and somebody's been looking at it at a low resolution. All of a sudden, their shots are out of focus, and they never saw it. So it's kind of you got to be careful with that. If you're not looking at something that has everything, you got to be careful what you might be missing. And when I get it onto HDR, I see all these little things. They pop up. They just come out. We never saw them before. Where'd that come from? And it's exactly the same thing that happened when we went to HD.
But you work only with A-grade talent, some of the finest actors and actresses in the world who are flawless in their performance in every possible way. But I do recall with some of the actors I've worked with that they would rather be shot a little bit soft, a little bit of Vaseline on the lens in the old term, and all of a sudden we're increasing resolution, we're increasing edge detail, and we're making these people look about 15 years older than they ever want to look in real life. It sounds like technology and the art are in conflict, true?
It is in a way, but it's your decision as a cinematographer to put that nose grease, Vaseline on, whatever you want to do. When you have a nice wide shot and all of a sudden it's out of focus, and you didn't see that because you were in a lower resolution, things like that.
But you
It's
fix
not
that
what
in
you want.
post. That's your job to fix in post. So that's
Well, yeah, and there's some things we can do, but we can't. There's only some things.
Mike, wearing your hat from a large major studio, are you feeling the most pressure to edit in 4K? Are you feeling the most pressure to edit in HDR? Or are you feeling the most pressure to do both?
Well, Sony already, well, I guess I should ask it this way. When you're saying editing, do you mean like the final conform and everything like that? Or do you mean
Answer
the
that is-
creative aspect and doing creative editorial?
Okay, let's do it in two ways. Let's do the creative and let's do the final conform.
We have had some requests for people to do creative editorial in 4K, and it's now possible. The editorial systems from all the major vendors, again, already work in 4K.
So
and-
wait, I want to make sure I'm hearing correctly. You've had requests and you are editing 4K, or you've had requests and you're not editing 4K?
I don't know if there's currently anything going on right now, but I've had requests, and I believe we've done some work editing in it, and I think people found value in being able to spot things, like when you're really going through and trying to figure out if this is really, really the shot you want. Well, is it in focus and things like that, and that can be necessary.
Okay.
But as far as finishing, yes. Sony Pictures is a big advocate of 4K. They built up a really large library of 4K titles. So any job that's shot in 4K, Sony will typically finish in 4K. So yes.
Michael, speaking as an independent, where are you seeing the interest? 4K, HDR, wide color gamut, all the above? Where's the money?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it kind of goes back to my tripod theory, because when each of these systems lived on their own, they were tied to certain initiatives that different companies that you either loved, hated, or were indifferent to promoted. Now that they're finding themselves together, some people are using, actually KeyCode used it on the website for this. It's actually a term I don't like, but it's correct, and that's a better pixel versus more pixels. Now, I don't think that's accurate. That's not a knock against Kiko. They're saying it right because people often phrase it that way. Is it about more pixels or better pixels?
It's like a pixel that goes to the gym.
Exactly. And the problem is with that is defining a better pixel is a religious argument. More pixels is not religious. We can absolutely measure and define more. Better we can't. So it's dangerous to sometimes, or it can be dangerous to use measurements like better, right, or best, or so as these things have come together, to answer your question, the tripod is stable. And now it borrows a little bit from company A, which I like, company B, which I didn't like, but company C I never heard of before. But when they come together and they put a picture on it, like Bryan says, even at Best Buy, you can go, that's better. And I feel better when I see that. And I can measure that it is brighter, which is not a religious issue. It has more pixels, which is not a religious issue. It has more color, which is not a religious. We can measure all those things. Therefore, that is better. And the tripod makes something measurable, and the consumers are buying it. This is not, we're putting this out, but I am so confident in this. This is not a fad, and it is not a force-feeding situation that something like 3D was. And this is not, and I don't think 3D was intentionally meant to be force-fed. I think James Cameron actually deserves more credit for actually creating the largest rollout of digital cinema initiatives of all time, because he insisted on something that was really powerful about distributing his product the way he wanted it to be. And people enjoyed it that way. I don't know that anyone followed up since he started it quite as good as he did.
How I could start with where's the money and you end up with James Cameron was one of the most brilliant answers I have ever heard. Where is the money?
The consumers are
Wait,
investing
no,
in this.
Michael, nice try,
Yeah.
but no, it doesn't work. I don't, how many consumers come to Light Iron demanding to buy a finished product? The answer is none. So Light Iron speaks to the broad industry. Who in the industry is coming to you with checkbook in hand saying, we need HDR, we need high resolution post services? For a company that's trying to make a decision of buying a $30,000 monitor, they need to know that $35,000 is coming back because they got it. Where's the money?
I see. The answer for who is demanding this and who's paying for it is generally found in the broadband groups. The broadband groups who are creating content have a motivation to do something that the broadcasters cannot. That's capitalism, you know.
So you're talking Amazon, you're talking Netflix, you're talking Hulu, those would be the people that are interested?
Even down to Microsoft and Apple and groups that have an initiative that does not utilize a technology that limits them in this area. It is not simple to transfer a master control room and a satellite feed to a new resolution or a new color space or a new dynamic range. That is complicated stuff. It sometimes takes rockets and NASA and JPL. But Netflix, you don't even know when updates are happening to your software. When broadbanders switch from H.264 to HEVC, which is the next advanced compression delivery package, you won't even know it happened. You'll just notice everything got better. And they didn't have to launch a satellite in the sky. They didn't have to upgrade 40 different relay stations across Kansas. They don't have to do any of that. It's literally an imperceptible upgrade. Those are fences that don't exist for the broadbanders. And they are the ones, I think HBO is going to be the best example of the first cable network to demonstrate how to move to become a broadbander, where the current broadband leaders now were never broadcasters. And I think the networks will be the last people to do that. So those are the people who are funding this on the creation side. And it's not cheating to say the consumers are funding it on the exhibition side because they want better panels, they want bigger panels, and they want brighter panels.
So, Mike, wearing your Sony hat again, and obviously you cannot speak for the company, so I'm not asking you to do any kind of official Sony says kind of thing. But where's the greatest interest on the part of the creative folks that you're working with? Is it Is it in the higher resolution? Is it the wider gamut? Is it the HDR? Is it all three of the above? Where's the interest?
I would say everybody we talk to wants bigger, better pixels. They want better content overall, higher quality content. You know, I don't know how many people here have seen HDR, but it's really pretty remarkable, and I think that a lot of people just kind of want to see what they could do in that space.
So we've got, staying with you for a moment, putting your engineering hat on.
Sure.
You're a small shop, 3 or 4 editors, as opposed to a giant shop. You're profitable, which is a miracle in these days, but you're profitable, you got money to invest in gear. What do you invest in as a post house?
When it comes to HDR?
Well, remember, we've got his bigger, better pixels. We've got all 3 of the tripod is sitting right there. So we want to be able to support any leg of this tripod. What do we have to spend money on? What do we get?
Oh, geez. I don't know. I'm really excited about HDR. I would find a way to find the monitor that works in it. I mean, it's sort of, you know, I like working in cutting edge, groundbreaking sort of stuff. And I would say that HDR is exciting to me. As a consumer and also as a geek, right? I don't know though, I'm not in the best spot to sort of pick what hardware they should purchase.
Bryan, when you're doing your color grade and making magic, are there rules to color grading 4K or rules to color grading HDR? Similar to, I mean, we use scopes when we're doing HD to make sure stuff stays within specs, et cetera, et cetera. Do we have the same kind of guidelines when we're dealing with these additional formats?
Pretty much. Once again, depending on the display. There are certain displays that, you know, go this high and certain that go this high. The HDR signal, I can get a lot of depth out of. Sometimes, depending on the monitor I'm doing this for, I have to be careful. I have to reel it back a little bit. Other than that, no. I mean, a picture is a picture, and it's.
One of the things I learned long ago is don't judge everything solely by eye. And again, I don't have your eyes, so that's probably a good thing for me and a bad thing for you. I use scopes a lot. When you're color grading, are you paying attention to scopes at all, or are you doing everything based on how it looks on the monitor?
I do use scopes to see if, you know, if I'm clipping, crushing, little things. Other than that, I can throw them out the window. It doesn't matter to me what the scopes say if the picture is right. Nowadays, I don't have to worry about, oh, my saturation's too high, this and that. You know, things we used to worry about in the old days.
How come?
Because it just, you know, back in standard def days, things would fall apart if they got too hot. It just doesn't happen anymore. I'm going to look at the picture, and because I'm going to be sitting next to the DP, and he's not looking at the scopes. He didn't even know what they look like. It pretty much goes by the picture. I'm going to look at scopes as a guide here and there. But, no, other than that, and color correcting is pretty much the same. It's just I have a lot more to work with. In my 30 years, it's like the third time I've seen a big change, and it's really nice to see.
I want to wear my business hat for a second because I want to have people be able to buy all this stuff, but more importantly, I want to have them make money after they bought all this stuff. I think making money has a very nice sound to it. So Michael, I'm going to start with you. If somebody comes to you, do you charge more for a 4K edit or an HDR edit or a wide gamut? Or is the cost the same regardless of what media they bring to you? Because I'm going to ask all 3 of you the same question.
Yeah, we charge more for HDR finishing than we do 4K SDR. And we charge a little more for 4K than we do 2K, but not much, because I built the facility for 8K, so 2K, you don't really get much of a discount going down to 2K. It's just kind of a pain. So 4K, more than half of my business is 4K, and there's not a lot of discount for not taking advantage of that.
Same question.
I would say probably the biggest cost is there's not many HDR monitors right now, which means that you just can't simply move jobs around your facility. I don't currently work at a facility, so I don't have any different rate cards. But I mean,
But you worked in a facility up until you got promoted to your new
Correct.
august position. Did the facility that you were working for back then?
Colorworks did not
Did
charge
not.
any more for 4K. We had basically designed the entire facility to work in 4K from day one. To my knowledge, they didn't charge any more to work in 4K just because that was just what we did.
Bryan, when you're building, do you build differently for formats?
Well, I don't bill, so time-wise, the way I work is it's all based on time. And I'm sure that the client is being billed more to sit in a theater and things like that. 4K takes up more space. It slows down the machines a little bit, so you have to, we as a facility have to spend more money on, just power. But in color correction, no, it's about the same amount of time that we spend on a HDR as we do on something else. And that's hard to judge. I mean, I could sit with a client for 2 weeks. I could sit with them for 2 months. There's no way.
But really, the amount of time it takes for an HDR grade is roughly the same as
Yes,
to use Michael's wonderful term, an SDR grade?
Yeah, and yeah, it's, whether it's a 4K, for me, once Mike has everything running at speed, for me, if I'm in whatever color gamut, whether it's a high color 2020, if I'm 4K, if I'm HDR, it doesn't matter, time-wise. The only thing that takes a little longer is we ooh and ah at the picture a little more, but other than that, it's pretty much the same.
But I want to add to that one thing, which is important. When you do 4K, and if you did something in 4K and then finish it and deliver it in 2K, there's virtually no compromise to the picture. Not really a big compromise to the picture. If you look at an HD at home, and it was 4K at the lab, it looks good. Unlike that, you cannot do HDR and then just instantly say, now make this SDR. It doesn't work that way because the curves are not as transitionable as resolution is. I think a good comparison, which is kind of old school but funny, is we know that when we shot scope movies and then had to make a 4:3 pass, someone was going to lose. Someone is going to be disappointed. If you took HDR and just crammed that into SDR, someone's going to have to make a compromise. So the only way where I think it would cost more is if you want to do it right, you need to trim it.
Yes.
And you need to do it twice. Maybe not from scratch, but you're going to redo a lot in order to create two optimized outputs. And I'm pretty certain a lot of people won't do that, and we'll end up with a great HDR version and kind of a lousy SDR version where we don't have that with 4K or wide color gamut, where you can take high res and maybe extended dynamic or extended color gamut and transition that one button to HD. It actually looks pretty good. We're not going to have that same simplicity with HDR.
In about 5 minutes, we're going to wrap up our formal conversation, and we're going to ask for audience questions. We're also going to invite you to give us questions as well. Remember, on Twitter, use the hashtag, the number 4KHDR post, 4KHDR post. It'll show up on our magic monitors on the back, and we'll be able to take your questions as well. But before we turn it loose to the ravening hordes, I just have a couple more questions. Mike, is there a common agreed upon spec for HDR or wide color gamut or 4K? I mean, Michael has already described the fact we seem to have about 17 different 4K formats, all called 4K even when they're not. We can't even agree on what HD is. It sounds like 4K is even worse. Do we have a spec that we can meet?
There have been some specs developed and codified by SMPTE. One of them is what's called an electro-optical transfer function, which is the response curve for the monitor. Since CRTs were invented, we basically have been gamma encoding images. And the ST2084 is a perceptual quantized EOTF that's designed to be extremely efficient and be able to capture a huge dynamic range and have work at reduced bit depths without banding. So that's one thing. The ITU, I don't remember which year that came out, but the ITU standardized on Rec 2020, which is a much wider color gamut than Rec 709 or P3.
So the short answer is that
There are standards
we're
and
bleeding
people
edge,
working
but
on them.
we've got a firm ground on which to stand.
Yes, I mean, you know, SMPTE and the ITU and industry alliances are all working on specs to make this work for consumers and work for professionals mastering content.
Okay, Michael, a theoretical question for you. We've been debating 4K this evening.
No, we
Red,
haven't.
well, Red is already shooting 5K and 6K. NHK has announced that it's doing an 8K demo in 2016, and NAB and probably IBC have got 16K camera demos that are coming up this year. Is 4K just a transition we should give up on it, just wait another couple of months and suddenly we're in an 8K environment, and then wait another couple of months and we're in a 16K environment, and then wait another couple of months and all of a sudden the $30,000 monitor that we invested in this year needs to be $60,000 because we need a 32K monitor? I mean, help.
No. The answer is no. The truth is, UHD and 4K will be a mezzanine exhibition format for, I believe, a decade. And what will change for the first time is we're separating the exhibition resolution from the acquisition resolution. And the acquisitions may go on a scale like you described. Red has announced an 8K camera, and in the way things work, if you oversample at the source, meaning you shoot more pixels at the beginning, they all translate to a better picture at the end, even if it went down to high def. The fact of the matter is, people sometimes say, I think high def looks so great, and this is only 1080p. And I always say to them, you're fooling yourself because you're looking at a 1080p picture that came from a sensor that was this big. And when you looked at sensors that were 1/3 of an inch or 2/3 of an inch 10 years ago, that on 1080p didn't blow anybody's minds. And so the oversampled sensors that we're dealing with now do a better translation to even HD. Ergo, an 8K sensor will do a better translation to 4K. Ergo, 4K will stay as a mezzanine exhibition format, again, I believe, for about 10 years.
Do you agree?
I totally agree. I mean, if you look at what film was sampling at much higher dynamic range and much higher resolutions than any of the display systems we were working with. And I think everybody loves the way that films had looked in standard dynamic range and Blu-ray, and now continuing on in 4K.
I have about another 45 pages of questions, but I think I'm going to pause for just a second. And Matt, you want to give me your magic tablet? We'll see what Twitter's been saying, and we'll also take a look at questions from the group. Let me just get some instructions here from my backup team. You want me to go to your magic tablet, or you want me to go to the audience first?
There's a Twitter question, and then we're just going to get a microphone to go.
This is, are there diminishing returns? Sorry, I don't know who wrote the question. So, are there diminishing returns as you expand dynamic range, like when you increase resolution higher and higher, you're not able to see the edge detail? There's a point where you can't see the difference.
That's a good question.
I think that would be really hard to answer. There are people actually, again, just like standards organizations, there are people that are working on perceptual studies and things like that. I know that there are studies where they've shown people imagery that's up to over 10,000 nits, and people want more, but I don't know if that could
But
be
Joe
easily.
and Mary Beer Can sitting on the couch in the living room, are they going to want to watch that?
I don't.
We don't know yet.
Yeah, I mean, give me a display that shows it, and I'll tell you what I think.
If they see it.
Yeah,
If
I
they
think
see
that, in high dynamic range, really, the brighter your display can get, in most cases, it's just more detail that he can keep, right? And detail is really, and it creates the sharpness, the sensation of reality. This HDR, we can talk about all this technical stuff. It's closer to reality, right? Human eye can see 1,000,000 to 1 without adapting to bright areas or a bright environment or a dark environment. We're getting closer to that in displays, which means we can display something much closer to reality, right? Like on a standard dynamic range TV, you could never show that light that bright, and I don't have my meter, so I can't measure it, but there's, if you had a really high-end, high dynamic range display, you can much more accurately represent this environment here.
Bryan, we've got another question. How does shooting in a flatter profile, wait, guys, you're going too quick. How does shooting in a flatter profile, like CineStyle, affect an HDR grade?
A flatter profile.
So they're talking about the camera encoding. Okay, so for like a camera, that specifically is Technicolor CineStyle. That's for the Canon cameras. Okay, so CineStyle was developed. I actually worked with some of the guys that helped develop it to encode a larger dynamic range signal than Rec. 709 when recording on the camera. So basically, it allowed. At the time, the Canon cameras were recording an 8-bit file, and that's traditionally pretty good for standard dynamic range. They wanted to be able to stuff a wider latitude into the same, so it's a log encoding, which basically does that. It allows you to capture more low light detail and more highlight detail in the same sort of package than you would if you were gamma encoding or linear encoding.
But since we kind of said 13 or 14 is
Yeah.
where we feel that particular encoding is probably on the edge of what would benefit from HDR because it's still a little compromised in what it can actually see.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and if you're flattening it out more, then I have to stretch it more. You have more,
Well,
you could have more.
I guess that is something. So basically, if you're something that should be noted is log encodings. So basically, if you have a box that's this big, right, and you want to, and we'll just call that a Rec. 709 display, if you want to actually capture a larger dynamic range than that display can do, you basically flatten it out using a log encoding. So that's why it appears flat when you look at it on a standard dynamic range monitor or on your fixed monitor.
We've got a philosophical question, Michael. How will virtual reality or assisted reality affect the resolution game?
Oh, virtual reality and assisted reality and so on will only enhance the game because as Mike just pointed out, this is all about creating things to be more real. That's exactly what those people are after. The gaming community is hungry for more realistic integration with their games. And so high resolution, high dynamic range, virtual reality, high frame rate, all those things are that immersive, magnetic kind of appeal to reality or hyper reality. So that's another major consumer demand or exhibition outlet for this type of technology.
Yeah, I mean, you know, with VR displays, the higher the resolution, the higher the frame rate, the higher the dynamic range, the better the system is.
Yeah.
Okay, questions from here? In the front row, center. Just a second, we got to get a microphone to you or nobody's going to hear what you have to say.
Hello, I'd like to introduce myself as a virtual relic. In about 1980, when the first television media shows were being put out, I remember walking into the LA Convention Center and seeing a 30-inch monitor from 1,000 feet away. I was like, wow. So can you imagine an 8K, a 16K, whatever K ratio you're going to put on it, from 10 feet away? What people will
We'll be
want.
looking at 16K pictures on our cell phones. What do you mean? It's, we can do our grading there. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm talking about normal human beings, please. You can imagine the perspective of what children will want to see, and when they get to an age that they can critique something, will want to have presented to them.
See, my perspective, I'm going to let these guys answer, but I don't think you can see a 16K image.
You can feel it.
Ah. No, I disagree with that. But the eye, the focal part of the eye that has the highest resolution is a 7-megapixel image, which is like, in 4K is a 10-megapixel image. So the eye itself can't see beyond 7 megapixels. Why should we care about 16K?
The eye can't see further than that, but it focuses on a very small area. So you're talking 7 megapixels in a very small area, the center of what you're looking for. Your
Just that
peripheral
part is
vision.
7.
Yeah. So the bigger the picture gets, the more we'll see it. And you will see it in your eye. Maybe not if you're looking at that, you know, at his smile exactly, but when you look at the overall picture, there's much more, yeah.
I also agree. You know, they thought Jesse Owens was the fastest man in the world. No one could ever run faster than him. He wouldn't even place in a high school track meet today. Our bodies change. Our ability, I think it was Ray Kurzweil, a futurist, I think it was Ray that said that he has a theory that the natives of South America couldn't actually see Spanish ships approaching because it was so foreign to the adults to see a shape that was that impossible to cognitively take in that it was invisible to them. And the point is, our brains adjust based on what we feed them, especially through life.
Yes, except Panavision, a company that you may have heard of, did a test on 4K comparing 4K to 2K images. And as you know, in a theatrical environment, the ideal viewing position is 1.5 times to 2 times the screen height out from the monitor. And when they projected a 2K image on a theater screen and projected a 4K image on the theater screen, people sitting at the optimum distance could not see the difference between 2K and 4K. So they, wait, I'm almost done. They moved people closer until they could finally see the edge detail that was available in a 4K image on an 80-foot theatrical screen. And to be able to see it, they had to sit 6 feet away from a theater screen to be able to see the difference between 2K and 4K, which would mean that to see the difference in a 16K image, we'd have to be about 6 inches away from the 80-foot screen, which strikes me as, even with the best brains in the world, it's going to be a little bit awkward to see.
That would be awkward, but that's based on information. That test you spoke about was done incorrectly and run improperly, and the results are incorrect. So,
But other than that,
here's a simple way to answer it. It's really easy. More is always more. Yes. No matter what, more is more. More can never be less. More here cannot be less further away from it. Therefore, if it was true, which makes no sense, if it were true that 4K was lower resolution when you were more than half a screen height away from it, that would mean 1K would be 1/8 the resolution. Why would that not apply to 1K resolution or HD resolution or standard F resolution?
sweetheart, listen, let's just
It doesn't
focus.
make any sense.
I'm not saying it's less.
Yeah.
Less is never less than more. More is more than less. Less is not more than more. More is less. But what I'm saying is that if you can't see it, if a tree falls in the forest, can you hear it if you're not there? And the answer is no, you can't. But I digress. Other questions before we get into a fist fight? Matt, by the way, I've pushed the wrong button on your magic slate. I need to get back into the application. Other questions? Oh, come on, don't be shy. Get the microphone back front and center, please.
I really don't. I was just testing your metal.
We may have a question on Twitter, but I've managed to switch the iPad off. So I need somebody to turn the iPad on so I can see what my questions are. Did I see a
I think we
question?
have one,
Yes.
yeah.
Hang on, let's get a mic to you.
So since I have to have a more expensive monitor to grade in HDR, and there's going to be a trim pass involved, is there a downside to grading traditionally in HD and then doing whether that takes 2 days or a week or 2 weeks, and then spending my day of trim pass to the HDR version? Or do I have to start with the HDR version
Yes.
and then do a trim pass to the HD version?
Good question.
In an answer, yes. You have to do the HDR first. It's kind of like what we've been doing for a long time with color gamut. When we do a P3, which is a bigger color gamut, we can go to 709.
Yeah.
Because we're going this way. I can't create what's not there. If you do a standard, when I do let's say a P3, just a straight P3 movie, the whites I'm gonna pull down a little bit because they're gonna clip. So I have to bring those down and soft clip them and bring the blacks up a little bit. Well, now I've got all this range. Once I've clipped that, once I've pulled that, kind of mushed it down, I can't pull it back up. I mean, I can make it brighter, but the detail's not there. So you have to start with this HDR, this big, picture, and then you can massage it down from there.
Good
You
question.
can't really go the other direction.
Mike, question coming in from Twitter.
Sure.
They're asking, how is HDR video encoded or decoded for the non-engineering geek?
Well, as Michael brought up earlier, there's a new codec called HEVC, and there is a 10-bit version of HEVC, which is known as HDR10. And so basically, it will be encoded using HEVC.
So just like we're used to doing H.264,
Correct.
HEVC is the H.265 that we've been reading about, which is also called HEVC.
Correct. It's
Which-
much higher efficiency.
We're seeing that that file sizes decrease about 30%. Given the same data rate, we can get the files smaller, or in the same size file, we can get higher image quality compared to 264.
Yes.
Okay.
You want to start a rumor?
You do a great job
I'll
of
start a rumor.
start a rumor.
There's a rumor, I don't know this, so I'm not breaking any NDAs, but there's a rumor that on the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, FaceTime is now displayed through HEVC, compressed through HEVC. And a lot of users of FaceTime on the 6 has noticed that the quality of FaceTiming dramatically improved with the 6 phones versus the 5 phones when the camera didn't, the front camera didn't. And so that would be an indication that Apple, like a lot of people, are playing around with HEVC, and that's a place maybe you could do an experiment or test yourself. What's the quality of transmitting over FaceTime on a 5 versus a 6? That's the same bit rate, but a better image.
One of the questions I get a lot is, when does H.265 show up in common encoding applications like compressor and media encoder and others? And so far it has not. So it's still in the realm of not yet ready for common professional use.
I believe the paperwork is done, right?
On which
On
part?
HEVC.
Yeah, but
It's licensing now.
Yeah.
Like the actual package is complete. It's all in the minutia, I think, of licensing it to everybody.
yeah, because there's intellectual property in any one of these encoders, and it's usually they form a consortium, and
But the spec is done.
yeah,
Spec was done January of 2013.
yes.
You guys have been dawdling. Get on the stick. So next question coming in from Twitter, Michael. Will consumers see high frame rate content before high dynamic range?
Oh, great question. You see high frame rate content now, but it's artificial because people are unfortunately investing in, it's not their fault, but the manufacturers are investing in building artificial high frame rate display systems, which
For marketing purposes.
for marketing purposes. I think it was born out of walking into a Best Buy, seeing 45 monitors on the wall, and you realize as a consumer advocate, how are you going to get these two people to see yours? And so the manufacturers came up with ways to get their monitor look better and better and better and better when it's in a sea of monitors, and high frame rate became a good way to do that. Unfortunately, that mode can't turn off, even though it should be known as store mode. I think in store mode it's safe and fair and fun, but I don't want store mode to come home with me because that's not a representation of anything else. So the answer is yes, you do see HFR before HDR, but if you're talking about actually photographing in HFR, high frame rates like 60p or 48p, you will see those after HDR because we have to decide whether or not HDR looks good at 24 frames per second. Because the contrast is so dynamic, the difference between 1,000 nits or super bright and 0 off, the difference is so dramatic. If you imagine a credit scroll, you ever seen a credit scroll is white and black, that's it. It's the only time you're ever going to see white and black on a screen. Credit scrolls jitter, right? Why are they jittering? They're not jittering any different than the rest of the movie jitter. The movie jittered exactly the same way the whole time, except the movie didn't have black and white pixels touching each other all the time and transposing places. That is creating this illusion of jitter. And HDR creates, it increases the perception of jitter because black and white is further apart, so it jitters more. And the solution, which is ironic, is to add more frames per second, and the jitter goes away.
Well, part of the jitter was also injected by interlacing. Interlacing made
No,
things...
no, I'm talking about progressive, interlacing is a type of jitter, but progressive jitter, super clean, uber clean jitter is there.
Yeah,
And HDR, it makes it worse.
on very high contrast moving images, you will see jitter.
So using camera cards is a better idea than having a credit roll, because you
higher
won't have the
resolution.
jitter.
Or you'll
or
have
higher
jitter.
frame rate,
Higher
Higher
frame rate.
resolution.
yeah,
Yeah.
So the rule then is just give up on credits.
Yeah.
maybe.
Well, yeah.
There are companies who have given up on
I didn't mean to
credit
screw
rolls.
everybody over on credits. I'm just saying that the actual credits is an example today where jitter's visible. That jitter you will notice more, not in credit scrolls, but actually in people just talking in HDR material. The jitter is more pronounced in a normal setting.
Bryan, changing the subject, but you talked about this before, but we just want to have you come back to it. Question from the Twitter is, how much more time is needed to grade HDR over standard dynamic range? You spoke to it. Just give us a summary of your answer.
It really, if my output is, my target is just HDR, it really doesn't take me any longer. Once I'm going, I'm going. A picture is a picture. There's not a lot. In fact, sometimes it's less, because I don't have to worry about clipping and things like that as much. I can see into the blacks. The blacks they're so much blacker, but you can see into them. So sometimes I can actually get through it a little quicker.
Because you've got more flexibility?
I can see more. I don't have to stretch things and compress them as much.
Yeah.
So that can speed up the process. Once again, as Michael said, if you then need to output, another a SDR. Yeah, this is still all a work in progress. There's no magic.
No, but what
yet.
impresses me is that...
I asked Sony to build us a box, by the way, before this started, to do that for us.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's-
beautiful.
Yeah.
What impresses me, though, is that it is essentially the same amount of time.
Yes.
That you have a different result, you have a different end that you're going to, but it's not taking a whole lot longer to do HDR, twice as long, 3 times as long. It's essentially the same.
Yeah.
Just more flexibility in the final image quality that you create.
Would you say there's less windowing and stuff that you have to do? Because, I mean, basically power windows and a lot of that were allowing you to bring higher dynamic range things and fit them into the standard dynamic range.
It depends on how it was shot, who shot it, this and that. But a lot of most of the time that I save is on skies, clipping, trying to dig something out of the blacks. I don't have to deal with that nearly as much. It's there. Windowing, I tend to stay away from a lot of windowing, unless the client's here. I'll window all day long and things like that, but I don't want to relight what he did. So, it really, for me to get through a picture, it's about the same amount of time, really. It doesn't really take me any longer.
Okay. Other questions from the audience in the front, right over here?
So I know we were talking about the tripod and how no one picture advent is winning out, that it's high resolution, spatial resolution, dynamic range, color gamut, et cetera. But can you address one thing with regard to higher resolution, meaning smaller pixels, meaning less light gathering power? There are some camera manufacturers that believe that in the better pixels, I think what they mean by better is higher quality, better light gathering, more contrast. Once you up the resolution to a certain extent, don't you have less contrast?
Not necessarily, no. And also remember you have this inverse thing, because if your pixels see less light because they're smaller, you increase your key light, and then you've just neutralized it all again, right? So if you're shooting under the exact same lighting conditions, certainly, but nobody is limited to have to shoot under the same lighting conditions. So if you're lighting at key at a 2.8, then just make it a 2.8 for whatever camera is required and get that light level at whatever you need it. But I do want to say what you made me think of is today we associate, and if this isn't clear, just to reiterate what was said there, if you have more pixels, they tend to have to be smaller because the wafer that you put photo sites on is, let's say, a fixed size of 35 millimeter. And if you have higher resolution and you want to cram more pixels on there, they each have to be fewer and fewer microns across. By doing that, you can decrease your sensitivity because the pixels are so small, there's less light to capture because they're all so much tiny, they're so tiny. That is how wafers work today, but the next iteration in gens of wafers are going to work with reflections and things like that, so that you can actually I think this is how the Hubble telescope works. I don't know. I'm not starting a rumor about those people, but it's all about gathering light, bouncing it, gathering it again, bouncing it, gathering it again, and it's like recapturing more and more, which allows you to amplify that light inside of but behind the actual element of the glass. And that is going to be the next possible explosion of dynamic range in the next settings of cameras, I think.
Yeah. I would also add to it that, a camera's sensitivity or latitude is judged both in like how sensitive it is to light, but it's also judged in like where the noise floor lands. So I think manufacturers continue to lower where the noise floor is, which basically is why we're now seeing a lot of extremely high resolution cameras that also have 14 stops or higher in dynamic range. Like that's really like how much noise can you tolerate in your image, and that's kind of what the noise floor is. Mm-hmm. So,
Other questions from the audience?
there's someone right back there.
Thank you.
I'm curious, in a television grading environment, clients have gotten used to doing their work on nice, large 50-inch, 65-inch screens. Curious what your strategy would be with the current displays available, how to deal with that now limitation we're facing.
You can get depending on once again, what your target is. There's 42-inch monitors. There's a 50-inch, I think.
I know of a 42 and some 30s.
Well, there's also.
There were some demonstration monitors. Oh, well, yeah, and then there's a consumer monitor as well that could be used.
Prosumers. There's a lot of things. Everything's being created right now. Professional monitors, I think, they're still limited, and it's a work in progress. But I don't think you're going to be locked in to a 30-inch. If you want a certain monitor, which then, yeah, they may only make a 30-inch.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a ton of monitors available right now, and we're all hoping. I mean, for a long time, I've been hoping and wishing for a mastering monitor that worked in 4K. There are some available, but they're not large.
So what would be your strategy for how to deal with that right now?
For dealing with the.
Would you grade on the smaller monitor or grade on a bigger monitor with less quality?
No, a smaller monitor. If it comes down to quality in a mastering room, it's all about quality. I want a bigger monitor, but I'm not going to sacrifice the quality for that.
We use the highest end HDR monitor, the newest ones.
Who makes them?
Sony's X300, and then we also use a consumer confidence monitor, which is called a 940C, and that gives us the scale for being far away from the monitor, and it gives you the precision of being close to the professional monitor, and between those two, you're, I think, able to triangulate what is going to happen at home and what's really happening at total unity.
Yeah, and the other thing is that we have to look at what the highest ability that we have. Some of these monitors are, 1,000 nits, 1,100 nits. There's one coming out that's, now these are more prosumer, 850 in this month, I think. And then there's one that's at 4,000. So you have to you know, I want to go at the best level I can because I know I can go down from there.
Yeah, in mastering, we always try and work on the best, and in HDR, the brightest with the deepest blacks and the widest color gamut, because we know that there are going to be future displays that will be able to, be able to see the world that way, I guess is the point. But yeah, like mastering, it's extremely important. We follow specifications in mastering, and it's in the highest quality, and we know that, yes, when it goes out into the wild and our materials out in the real world, there will be differences between consumer monitors, but we always like to fall back on standards, and that's why I'm the engineering nerd. I like standards.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Front row, center. Anybody in the back, raise your hands in case I'm overlooking somebody. Okay, go ahead.
So in displays, it sounds like it's all about the nits. And is there a defined standard for the number of nits necessary to display HDR? And if I'm going to plunk down $1,000 an inch for a monitor, how do I make sure that I'm at least getting the bare minimum number of nits to future-proof myself to the extent that I can?
That's hard. I mean, there are basically, I think that there are groups trying to differentiate themselves as far as like being HDR or a premium HDR experience. So the wider the color gamut and the brighter the display, the better the HDR experience is, right? Like you can look on, you know, a lower luminance display, and yes, you can get the sensation of extra detail and more dynamic range, but it really starts getting there when you start going up in the nit ranges. Because, I mean, if you guys have seen HDR content, you don't have to make it, skin tones don't have to be 10 times brighter than they already are, even though the display can go 10 times brighter. I mean, he's kind of our protector in a lot of senses, where he's making an image that looks beautiful and is not painful, and which means that the dynamic range of a majority of the image is within, I don't know, I'll just throw out a number, say 400, 300 nits, right? Your average picture level is not really dramatically increasing like the display can. Mm-hmm. But as you get higher and higher and higher brightness, you can still continue to have the image at these, you know, reasonable viewing levels, and then little things like high frequency detail, or like the glints of sun on chrome, all these other things can continue to be in the signal, and it just makes it feel that much more dynamic. And then the other side of it is you do want a display that has richer, deeper blacks. Like there are medical imaging monitors, there's a lot of monitors, there's outdoor viewing monitors that are extremely high luminance, but they don't have the rich, deep lowlights. And that's really what separates high dynamic range from
Remember, when you had 709, when 709 came out with HD, we didn't just run to the corners of the spectrum and make as much red as it's capable of doing, or as much blue or green as it's capable of doing. We never did that. We said the box got bigger than 601, which was where we were. I'm going to use more of the new box, but I don't have to run to the edges.
Yeah.
A mistake that a lot of people, I think, saw in 3D is some people went too deep.
Yes.
They got 3D, oh my gosh, and they went deeper and deeper and deeper, and that created some of a backlash. I think some of the better 3D movies were ones that were, the Z-depth was more like a diorama than things coming out at you, right? And it was more comfortable, and I think we missed that boat, and we kind of broke it, and it's too late. But in HDR, let's not make the same mistake we did in 3D where we go too deep. If we have 1,000 nits, you don't need to use them.
Yeah.
And if you use them for one shot over a series, an entire 24-episode series, that might be plenty. But a lightning strike at a moment where someone is murdered or killed or given some sort of superpower, that's a perfect place. But that may be it. The rest of the show can live fine at 102 nits, and it might be totally perfect.
It's not about a brighter picture. Not about a brighter picture.
More
or darker.
detail.
It's the detail. It's like exactly what Mike was saying.
I want to wrap up by asking each of our three panelists, and I'm going to start with Bryan. A person's decided to jump into Michael's tripod of wider gamut 4K HDR. What piece of advice would you give him?
Get the best display you can afford. All these things are going to keep growing. Resolution's going to get higher and higher and higher and higher. You know, I've got an 8K starting at the end of the year. It's just going to keep on going. Color gamut's going to keep on going, even though our eye can't see past a certain point. I think that working in HDR is not going to cost a lot of money on the infrastructure because you're, you know, maybe the higher bit rate, but you're not. If you're 4K, you're still 4K. But the display, which is really the hardest thing to buy right now, is the most important. I think the PQ curve spec is something like, was it 10,000 nit?
Yeah, it goes 0 nits to 10,000 nits. So that's the encoding spec.
And there's nothing that will display that now,
Yeah.
professional or otherwise. So as time goes on, the brightest one right now is 4,000 nits, and everybody says, well, you're never going to see that at home. That bullshit. You will see it at home. It may take a while. And then a couple years from now, they'll have something that's 6,000 nits or whatever. It just won't stop. But if you can get the best monitor, display, whatever your display is, that you can get right now, I think that's your best bet.
Mike, same question. What advice to somebody that's getting into it for the first time?
Check your color pipeline and do images no harm. You know, basically, there's a lot of different transforms and file formats that can, you know, you could go from a log encoding to a not log a big space to a small space and do damage in your workflows to the images, which you can't recover later on. So be gentle and do no harm.
Do no
It's
harm.
really, I mean, that's what we focus the most on, is making sure that the color pipeline is not doing any harm, and we're preserving basically the scene that was recorded on the camera, and then, you know, VFX people are working in the scene referred space, so they're recreating or adding to that scene in that same space, and we're continuing to make sure that we maintain all the image detail that was captured in camera, in VFX, and CG, so that he can then use it in the final product. Like if you do damage somehow to your image, you know, you reduce its dynamic range, he no longer has access to it.
Okay, Michael?
If you think about how people would test a number of lenses or different camera types or even location scouting and stuff like that, my advice would be to test it all the way through. I think Bryan made a great point earlier. He said this was like an infant. And HDR is in its absolute infancy. It doesn't even have teeth yet. It's such a baby. And that means there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to explore it and leverage it and even steer it and change it and manipulate it and control it. And the people that do testing now, who learn how to change their photographic techniques to better serve an HDR profile, are probably going to come out ahead in making sure their content is superior to somebody who didn't.
I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and I want to thank you for watching us. We've been having a panel which is put on by Keycode Media and Sony, talking about 4K and HDR images. We've had 3 outstanding guests on the panel, starting with Michael Cioni on my left, Mike Whipple in the center, and Bryan, whose last name I had to look up, Bryan McMahan, for representing, I think, the 3 different areas that we all need to keep in mind, which is planning for the future, getting the gear to work now, and making the gear that we've got now to look great, which is what our panel has been talking about. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank you for watching at home. My name is Larry Jordan. Have a good evening.